and welcome to Preston Manor. On the 14th of September 1930, a Mrs. Peregrine Birch sat down at her cottage, Apple Tree Cottage, Hare Hatch, Twyford in Berkshire, and wrote a letter. In the letter, she described an experience she'd had while staying as a guest at Preston Manor when the house was a private house. And in this letter, she meets one of our most enduring apparitions. I'm going to read you from what she wrote. She said, "The last experience was somewhat nerve-shattering, and she felt she could not sleep in the house again. She said she had retired to bed with a bad cold before dinner, and a bright fire burned in her room, and 4 tall candles were alight. It was quite early, not yet 10 o'clock. When reading her book, she was disturbed by all the brass candle rings on the 4-post bedstead ringing against one another, and the bed was slightly shaken. She laid down her book and looked all around the bed without moving, when suddenly there appeared at the post opposite a man's dead arm and hand, with cruel fingers clutching the post and moving upwards. She was so frightened that she gave one shriek, leapt out of the bed, through the door and across to the room opposite, where I stayed until I left Preston Manor." At the end of the letter she writes, "This is just a true picture of my experience, with no extra frills to make a good story, and I hope it may be of interest to you." The time the letter arrived at Preston Manor was the early days of Preston Manor as a museum, and the curator at that time was collecting ghost stories, hoping to put them in a guidebook. Now for me, when I consider the ghost stories of Preston Manor, I think we really have to examine all of them closely, and the dead man's hand story I have considered in depth, and for me, any story that begins, "I was in bed" or "I was awoken at night," well, I think you have to consider perhaps it was a dream. And there is a very particular dream state in which the sleeper is sort of awakened asleep at the same time, and it's called hypnagogic dream sleep. It can be quite disturbing, and we've all experienced it. There's a very simple version in which we drift off to sleep and have a very small dream in which we've tripped over or fallen off a cliff and we jolt awake, and it's not particularly frightening, that one. Others can be. There's another dream state which is connected to that, called, I love this, exploding head syndrome it's called, also known as episodic, to read this to you, episodic cranial sensory shock, in which the individual hears a noise. It might be a very loud noise, it may be someone shouting in your ear, or it may be the sound of curtain rings jangling around a 4-poster bed. Mrs. Peregrine Birch also writes, "I've added no extra frills to make a good story," which begs the question, did she like a good story? The era that we're looking at, the late 19th, early 20th century, was the age of the thriller, of Sherlock Holmes, and in fact there are 2 Sherlock Holmes stories in which the great detective finds something in a dead man's hand. So was that the book that Peregrine Birch was reading that night? We also must consider whether she had taken some of this, and this is laudanum, which could be obtained from any chemist at the time to help induce sleep. And I came across this great quote in a medical dictionary regarding laudanum, which the doctor writes, "Laudanum, yes, to induce sleep, which may be attended by dreams, sometimes pleasant, but frequently of the most painful character." My theory is that the disembodied hand seen by Mrs. Peregrine Birch was most likely a dream, although some say that the hand was seen by other people. It's the most enduring apparition at Preston Manor. It hasn't been seen for a great number of years.